Hey everyone, I'm Paul Muller, the host of the AI Forecast, a weekly podcast sponsored by the great folks at Cloudera, where we explore the past, the present, and the future of data and AI in the enterprise. And as always, we're joined by an array of leading companies and industry experts, and today is no exception. Well, unless you're running a tunneling company, it's a brave person who's going to call or make their call to action, I should say, to do something boring. But that's just what today's guest is hoping to do with AI, make it boring. Now, I'd hoped he was referring to the huge amount of industry hype, which he was going to get rid of, which, let's face it, could come down just a notch or two. But I don't think that's what he's talking about when he says boring. I think we're talking about the kind of boring you want from your airline flight, something that it might not be if we don't keep an eye on the automation and the people at the front of it. Well, to give us his take on why AI needs to be boring, I'm joined by Kal Al-Dubaib, who until recently was the founder of Pandata, which in 2024 was acquired by analytics and AI business Further. You can check them out, I think, at gofurther.com. In his new role, he serves as the head of AI and data science and has a mountain of experience applying AI and ML to real world businesses, something that is a point of passion for me. I like to get beyond the theory and into the benefit. Cal's also a prolific thought leader with dozens of podcasts, keynotes, and articles to his name, including Forbes and VentureBeat, just to name two. Equally impressive to me is that he commits time to paying it forward as an advisory board member for Women in Analytics. Welcome to the show, Kal.
Thank you, Paul. It's so great to be here. And hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
A bit of a power intro there. I'm keen to get into the topic of boring. But before we do that, we do a little thing called the Furious Four, the lightning round, call it what you will, just a way to kind of limber up mentally as we get into this. You ready to do it?
Yeah, let's dive in.
All right. What would people who know you best say is your superpower, Kal?
Reading a room and finding simple ways to communicate complex things.
Did you work on the reading the room, or is it something that's just come naturally to you?
Oh, I absolutely worked on it. And I can tell you horror stories of some of my early pitches when I launched my first startup.
You know what? We might actually get to that a little later on. That could be fun. That could be a lot of fun. All right. Next up, the most impactful technology of all time.
Not to pile on to the bandwagon, but I'm going to give mad appreciation to the foundations of natural language processing. It's a lot of these boring building blocks that really enabled the models of today. Like all of the innovation now is scale it up, scale it up. But the mathematics, it's the same math.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to forget how long we've been chipping away at this problem for. It's been a while. All right. What would you like to see AI automate for you in the future? Forget everyone else, forget all the technology building. What problem do you want it to solve for you?
So this is both the thing that I am the most passionate about and probably would scrutinize AI the most on, but planning spectacular trips. Emphasis on the spectacular.
On that, because I think it's that weird intersection of highly unstructured, which I would call, the word inspirational, amazing. I mean, highly subjective.
Yeah.
And intentionally looking for surprise, combined with the structure of, but I want the plane to be there when it needs to be there. My hotel room needs to be booked, although some of my best holidays ever were where the hotel room wasn't booked properly and I had to improvise, but we'll get to that later. But going to the topic we're going to talk to shortly, is that where you think some of the friction is as well, though, is like really giving the algorithm two almost contradictory requirements?
Yeah, like we allow these models and these systems to almost be too opinionated, versus recognizing that there's actually an art to pulling out information from users or clients, if you will. And so it's balancing, hey, we can optimize all these things, but we also have a human who might not know what they want. So how do we peel it out of them?
That's a really great point. And maybe we'll lean on this for 1 second more and we'll talk about it in the body of the podcast. But one of the things that just occurred to me is when I prompt a lot of the sort of the tools like, say, your chat GPTs or your Claudes or whatever, one of the things they don't do, which I look for in the quality of an employee, when I'm working with someone, especially someone worth promoting,
Sure.
is when I ask them to do something, they don't just do it. They'll often ask me questions to try and understand the mission and to get a bit further rather than just slavishly following my request. Whereas a lot of these
Yeah.
tools just kind of go, oh, you want me to book you a holiday? I'll get working on it. They don't actually stop to go, what kind of holiday? Give
Yeah.
me some examples of the best holiday you went on. You know what I mean?
Exactly, exactly. And you can make it frictionless. If you're like, I don't know, maybe here's 5 options. Which of these sound great? Or maybe let's, none of these, right? And so I often like, especially when I'm working with Gen AI these days, I force it to do that. I'm like, give me options first,
I
stop, lay
like
out
it.
some plans, more like three, less like two. And so I force it to do this, but it should intuitively do this.
Like a good assistant would. Exactly. All right.
Yeah.
Last but not least, as an exec, as an entrepreneur, curious, what are some of the best practices you picked up on personally when it comes to working with data that have just helped you be more effective?
Storytelling. It is one of the most critical and underrated skills, underappreciated skills, I think, in technical circles.
Mm.
Even today, I have so many stories, and some of them I'll share, where the model itself was perfect, the system itself was perfect. It did the job, and yet the project totally tanked because the value proposition wasn't communicated correctly. We didn't quite think about how does this translate into results or outcomes or decisions. And so that's a big part of my focus. And I think a sign of a good technologist is someone who not only knows how to build the thing, but can recognize how to communicate why it matters and how it's impacting things to other stakeholders and executives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Well, this is a perfect segue to the topic of making AI boring, I think. Um, tell us a little bit about your background to begin with. Where are we reaching you from today?
So I am based in Cleveland, Ohio. This is where I pay rent. I travel about half the time, so I joke. This is where all my stuff is. But prior to living in Cleveland, I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, and I went to college at Case Western Reserve University. And my way into data science was kind of roundabout. Changed my major 7 times. My family loved it. For the longest stretch, I was studying computational neuroscience, and so applied stats to biological problems, dealing with behavioral modeling and things like that, and that's what launched me into the world of data science.
And at what point in time did you decide to make the leap to entrepreneurialism?
It was forced upon me, I think. And there's a great gentleman by the name of Bob Sopko who unfortunately recently passed, but he tapped me on the shoulder one day while I was exhibiting at the undergraduate research showcase at my university. He said, "Have you ever considered commercializing this?" And I didn't even realize that was a career path. And so in 2013, I launched my first company based off of some of the modeling and research work I was doing and learned all of the ways to not sell data science to hospital systems, which ultimately, a lot of the lessons learned and the bruised shoulders, so to speak, that came out of that went into building Pandata. Professional services company where I founded it in 2016 around a time where data science skills were still relatively scarce. I think at that snapshot in time, there were fewer than 10,000 data scientists in all of North America. When you look at a market like Cleveland, where we have a lot of Fortune 500s, there were fewer than 150 in the entire greater Cleveland area, all of Northeast Ohio. And most of them worked for one of 3 companies. And so there was a lot of demand, and enterprises didn't quite know how to hire for this, how to put data scientists to work effectively, and that inspired a lot of my work. So I founded Pandata and built it mostly through word of mouth, and we ended up working with some incredible organizations. And over the 9 years of running it, it went from all things data science to machine learning focused projects to machine learning focused projects in heavily regulated environments. And I was following where the demand was going. As data science got more commoditized, there was more and more demand for specialized work building these models and these solutions in environments where there's a high cost to making mistakes, or we're dealing with sensitive data assets. And so this all connects to making AI boring, because I spent so much of my time building up Pandata on market education. I was trying to get executives to understand why it is they need a data scientist and why hiring a data scientist is not equal to the decision of having a Tableau license. Yes, these were conversations that I had back in 2016.
And you're probably still having a few of them now. I'm almost
Yeah, yeah,
certain. Yeah.
different tools, different tech, different terminology, but many of the same conversations.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how we always overestimate, the tools we've got. And it's a human foible, I'm sure. Like some of this, going back
Yeah,
to neuroscience, but I'm sure there's a lot of psychology behind the way humankind tends to look at a tool and just go, well, let's. I mean, there is actually a cliche for it, right? If all you
yeah,
have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
for sure.
So yeah, I've got that tool. Yeah, I'm good. So I'm just as curious. Aside from me, is
Yeah.
2016. You're relatively young, just graduated recently, I'm guessing.
Yep. No, I was older than you might think I was because I spent 7 years as an undergrad. So
Got it. Got
there's
it. But
only
I
that
mean,
detail.
yeah. But my point is, you've kind of emerged out of academia,
Yeah.
not necessarily renowned for its business acumen, and for
No.
teaching people the realities of a P&L, of dealing with things like the consequences of technology failure and regulatory compliance and so forth. I'm just curious, how did you find those first couple of years as you had to kind of make the shift from, I mean, you literally picked one of the hardest places to go to, which is highly regulated environments where they tend to grasp new technology the same way I look at a hand grenade with the pin taken out of it. It's like, whoa, like that
Yeah.
can only do damage. There's no good to come of this. How about, we'll talk about this next year. How did you go through a learning cycle, and what was that like, kind of going from being an academic to being a business person, effectively, or a business advisor?
So I spent a lot of times, like I mentioned with my first venture, learning this the hard way,
Mm,
getting a lot of no's, and then it became my survival mission: is how do I flip these to a yes? And it turned out a lot of that was education, or talking to the client about expectations. But it's an interesting quirk, and it was almost partially influenced by naivete at the time.
mhm.
But there were these needs at companies in healthcare. I worked with quite a few hospital systems, health insurance tech providers, life sciences companies, and um, they had these needs that were maybe six-figure projects, but not McKinsey scale or Accenture scale projects. And so there was a lot left on the table, but not a lot of other independent consultancies, at least not at the size that we were then, were tooled with the insurance, with the risk management, with the know how to be able to meet the needs of these projects. And so I found that they were willing to spend the money. And they did, in fact, have the problems and the scale of the data where it made sense to invest in these machine learning projects if we could find some way of getting them comfortable with it. And so there were a couple of things. Some of these were operational and in my control. Have a better insurance policy, and we probably spent way more on insurance than any other company our size. Have airtight data policy and procedures. The joke on our team, because many of our clients gave us dedicated laptops with their own security on it. And so if you didn't have at least three different laptops on my team, you weren't busy enough. We constantly switched identities. And because many of these clients had in person sites, one of them even had an air gapped room where we would have to physically go into the space. I ended up accumulating a series of these like Fortune 1000 company badges that I was rotating in and out of. So we
Yeah.
had many different identities, and that was stuff that we implemented. Then there was the getting them comfortable with it. Exactly. They hear AI and it looks like a grenade to them. And
Mm,
so how do you make that more palatable? Well, it turns out that when you stop treating it as a black or opaque box and go under the hood and show them, hey, this is a system, this is controllable, here's where the controls go. It turns out that it's a lot like these other problems that you've seen over here in systems design and engineering. And we can make this safe, and this is our plan to make it safe, and this is how we're going to bring risk management and compliance into these types of projects. It started flipping those no's into yeses. And then when we had our resume of we've worked with X number of clients in this space, we know what to do, we know how to train our team up on your data policies and procedures and practices, here's how we handle it. That's when the business really started growing in that direction.
fabulous. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about about these regulated industries. So you've given us some examples. I mean, healthcare is
Yep.
probably the big one. What when they think about risk
Yeah.
or insurance or whatever, how would you define risk? I mean, maybe let's start with that because I think
Yeah.
risk to one person's risk is another person's opportunity.
And a big thing, I spend a lot of time talking openly about risk and not to scare enterprises away, but to say you actually need to invest in mitigating it proportional to the value of a project.
Mm.
And so if the risk of an AI driven opportunity to drive a few clicks to your website is far greater than those clicks will lead to conversions, then maybe drop the project altogether. But if there's truly compelling business value here on the table, then there's some things that you need to do. So risk can be a function of two things. One, how likely is something to go wrong? And then two, when it goes wrong, how bad is that going to be? And that can look like brand reputation, excess cost to making a mistake. It could look like unintentional harmful biases, unequal performance of a solution with certain individuals. It can be emotional harm, physical harm, or cyber vulnerabilities or potentially compromising sensitive information. And so we take a bunch of these factors into consideration and we go through the exercise when it comes to these types of projects. If we're building an AI solution that, for example, is summarizing medical blogs, which is something that we've worked on recently with a hospital system, we consider how likely is this to lead to misinformation. Is there more convenience introduced into this? Is there some other way that we can minimize the liability? If we're talking about predictive models that are used for predicting who's most likely to be readmitted in 30 days for complex medical cases, are we over or under predicting in certain minority groups or in certain subsets of the population? And how do we get ahead of that? How do we know if that is likely to happen and what controls do we need in place? And so we walk our clients through a lot of these what ifs and we get them comfortable with how bad can this go and what control do we need to have in place to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and again, I'm reflecting. I'm going back to an earlier question, but again, I think what's jumping out at me here is you haven't mentioned technology a lot. You've spoken
Yeah,
about things like controls. You've spoken a lot about, I suppose there is some statistics in there, false positives and so forth being,
sure. Yeah.
or mechanisms for identifying it. But a lot of this really is about putting controls around it. How important is it to have somebody who's got um, that risk-oriented mindset on the team, someone who understands, maybe things like auditing and so forth, versus just the technologists?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. In fact, we went through an investment recently at Further where I managed to convince our leadership team to get several of our team members certified in AI governance. So we brought together folks from our data engineering practice, data science practice, and our legal counsel, actually. And we had IAPP, they're the International Association of Privacy Professionals, come in and facilitate a 2-day training to get us ready to go through one of the first formal certifications in the space. And we now deploy these team members who might be responsible for building a model or might be responsible for strategy and a client engagement to leverage the knowledge they gain through this program. And they leave with the certification not being legal experts or risk experts. They still have their core area of expertise, but they know what questions to ask.
So let's talk then about, let's imagine I'm an enterprise who's been looking at, I'm a regulated industry. I'm thinking about adopting AI for, let's just say, customer yield management, right? Or in other words, how do I sell more stuff to my customers?
Yeah, yeah,
Give me I guess let's just, okay, well, we don't even imagine this.
yeah,
I am aggressive. I'm keen to get things going. I'm worried about my competition who are going to be deploying this stuff. I hear a great sales pitch from, pick industry leader of the day. And I'm
yeah,
like, I walk into the boardroom and I start screaming at everyone saying, we need to get on this AI thing. We need to start deploying it
yeah.
now, or we're going to start losing customers to the other guys. Let's go. What do you say to those people?
So I actually have a client where we did this with, and at first it didn't go according to plan. It almost never goes according to plan the first time. But I love this story. It was actually a client that was working on building a model to help with patient selection.
Okay.
They oversee 50 million patient lives, and they get their claims on a monthly basis, and they're looking for indicators who's likely to qualify for these programs. And they used traditional heuristics to mine through rules based on different guidelines that were updated year to year. And that got them a pretty reasonable yield. They were performing, they were fully functional as a business without any AI. They wanted to do better. So they brought us in, they said, hey, could we use AI for this function? And we went through preliminary discovery process, we ran some numbers, we were able to show mathematically that that when we trained a model, we could identify 30% more than the individuals they were already uncovering because we were looking at past examples of who was actually approved by this program, whether or not they met the initial rules heuristic. Amazing. That amplifies their total population of who they could reach by a reasonable margin. We rolled out our pilot, and this thing tanked. If they'd normally get 10 people through a funnel of 100, we only got 2 in our initial pilot. And we learned.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. You made it worse.
Yeah, we made it worse. The AI actually made it worse. It looked like it made it worse. Yeah.
All right. There's an operative word in there, so it looked like it made it worse. Keep going.
Exactly. And so I was personally confused by this. I'd never seen a project go this way. It turns out the individuals responsible for selecting who gets the direct mail, they have year-end bonuses that depend on their selection quality.
Wow.
And so they have heuristics in place, and they're looking at who's being recommended for this month's outreach. And they were saying, no, this looks weird. This is coming from the AI pilot. Also, they have cases we're not used to. No, these are not good. These are not good candidates. And so they weren't moving them through. And so it looked like our model wasn't good at selecting. It wasn't the model. It was the humans that were making the decisions. And so we had to bring that team together and ask them, why are these patients not good patients? Our model says they are. You say they aren't. Walk us through it. And we started learning that we were identifying borderline patients, patients that were a combination of an age demographic in a certain region, et cetera, et cetera. And they'd say, oh, okay, I guess I could see how this one would work. But in general, we don't take the time to look at it this way. And so we also taught them how we trained the model, how we validated the model, and we redeployed this. We didn't change much at all about how the model worked. We just changed how they were willing to work with it. And we were able to grow their revenue by 18%. They were able to reach 18% more people on a regular basis. And now their entire process, many years later, is driven exclusively through machine learning. And the humans are now involved in scrutinizing. Are our patterns changing? Are we identifying new types of patients? What's weird? How do we make this model better? And we were also able to work with them on some risk controls, like is the model selecting from patients that are from certain minority groups, and or underselecting or overselecting, and how do we course correct that, and how do we monitor that over time? But that's an example of the type of work where, yes, there is in fact engineering, yes, there is in fact model training, the math matters, but equally as important is how you integrate that into human-led decision-making.
What's interesting about that, there's so much interesting, but what is leaping out at me is human in the loops become something of a catch cry for, or almost shorthand for, well, maybe the response to the fact that AI isn't boring enough at the moment, right? As we're worried about the AI tools or algorithms coming up with the wrong result, and you need a human to supervise it. What you're telling me there is I think, is the opposite. It's also true. Is that we bring confirmation bias to the table
Sure.
every time we make a decision, and we're sometimes overriding these technologies in the wrong way. Do you see that as being I mean, how do you resolve that though? Because I think
Yeah.
human in the loop gives me comfort. I like the idea that someone's sitting
Yeah.
there going, yeah, probably not a great idea to launch that particular missile in that direction right now. There's a second kinetic example for today. I don't know why. Or for us to turn the aircraft to the right instead of the left, right?
Sure.
To avoid whatever it might be, some birds. Keep a human there, make sure that it's doing the right things. The last thing you want your pilot to be saying is, wow, what's the computer doing now? Not
Yeah.
a
Exactly.
comforting thing, right?
Exactly.
But by the same token is you've got technology that's probably able to process more data than a human could ever hope to, and in the case of real-time systems, be able to respond more rapidly than our cognitive processes allow. How do we keep AI boring, but also at the same time make sure that the people who are meant to keep it boring aren't actually making the problem worse?
So you put AI on the shelf for just a moment. Let's
Yep.
assume we have an effective AI. That's a given. You want to
Okay.
roll something out, it's effective for the purpose. So we're gonna leave that on the shelf now. Now we're gonna talk about where I see most enterprises making a mistake. They treat the endpoint of the solution as whatever the AI is giving out, whatever the AI is outputting. In my experience, the endpoint is the decision that we're influencing. It could be a customer purchase decision. It could be an internal action that's being taken. It could lead or feed up into another process. But ultimately there are decisions in theory that these models are influencing either successfully or unsuccessfully. And that's the outcome we care about. So I don't really care about whether it's a human in the loop that's supervising the model or a model that's providing feedback for a human to then do something with it. I look at these decisions. And to give you a few examples, let's say we have a model we're using in radiology or an example in a healthcare system. We've seen these studies that say AI is better than radiologists. Well,
Yeah.
sure. AI
Yep.
is better than an overwhelmed, tired radiologist that has to work through 50 cases. But you know what's even better? An AI model that knows what it doesn't know, and it says, hey, I went through these cases. And these 20, I really couldn't make heads or tails of. I wasn't able to predict with enough confidence or identify features with enough confidence. Someone should manually review these. These cases, I feel confident saying there is nothing anomalous, and maybe we have a human come in and audit those periodically to make sure that that's the case. And then we have this other subset where it says, I think I found something. Here's where I think I found something. Here's why I think I found it. And in my experience, especially rolling things out to subject matter experts like clinicians, radiologists, care coordinators, they would rather have a model that makes mistakes more often so long as that model explains its reasoning versus having a model that makes a prediction but doesn't explain its reasoning.
So let's talk about then about the importance of explainable AI then, because I think that is another issue that probably doesn't get enough press. I think
You should.
everyone assumes that, especially the layperson assumes that you could always ask the AI, "Hey, why did you come up with this?"
Oh,
Do
yeah.
you want to talk a bit about the importance of explainable AI?
Absolutely. And so we learned this with a health system where we were deploying a readmissions algorithm for solid state tumor patients. So, notoriously complex cases, your standard readmissions algorithms don't work. About 20 to 25% of these patients get readmitted nationwide. It's a terrible burden on the health system and really poor outcomes for the patients. So, we built a model and we were able to identify with 80% accuracy who was going to come back within 30 days. It turns out, for the clinicians, that wasn't helpful. Having an alarm bell go off and say this patient's sick, do something, amongst the many other things they have to deal with, is actually not helpful.
Mm.
What's more helpful is laying out this patient is at risk for coming back in 30 days because they're on these medications, they're in this zip code that has low access to transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these are personal factors, some of these are clinical factors. Helps them do two things. One, if the model is in fact wrong, they can see what led to errors in the reasoning. Two, if the model's correct, it helps them draw a conclusion more effectively on what they can do to change the outcome for that patient. And so we found in these instances in projects like this, whether it's lead scoring for a sales team or clinical risk management, that the experts at the end of the pipeline would rather work with a model that's slightly less accurate but comes with that interpretability
Mm.
that allows them more freedom to make better decisions than a model that is slightly more accurate, but it's like rolling a dice and you don't know when it's going to work well and when it's not going to work well.
Yeah, and I suppose having the telemetry or the data to be able to peer inside that model and understand how it reached the conclusions that it did, and therefore well, I guess again to be able to go back to your stakeholders and explain how you got to where you did.
For sure.
Anyway, so I want to jump a little bit now
Yeah.
to the to the listener who might not be in, say, a highly regulated industry and not so concerned about boring AI right now. What lessons do you think the broader market can take from what you've learnt about boring AI, or making AI boring, I should say? Different thing.
So I was talking to one of my team members today about this, and we both decided that maybe system is a much more effective word than model. Models these days are getting really complex, and so we have these large language models, and then we've decided to brand this whole AI agent or agentic AI moment, and we keep doing things cosmetically to the titles of models and AI systems, and I think just treating it like a system and say underneath this black box that you're being sold by a vendor, there's actually components and there's elements. And there's dependencies and there's things that can influence whether a language model is likely to make stuff up or give you a reasonable answer. And so when I talk to clients, even in industries like retail, at the very least, they don't want to put customer-facing applications out there that share information that would be contrary to the brand's guidelines or hallucinate or even depart from the brand messaging standards. And so a lot of that depends on being able to recognize when a model is likely to hallucinate. That means understanding what questions are in scope, what questions are not in scope, having kind of rules and statements around that. But another thing that's equally important, it turns out, is documentation. I just gave a talk recently where I talked about the fact that standard operating procedure and process documentation has just gotten promoted to a data asset. When we talk about the world of large language models and the ability to build workflows, let's say you're an HR department, you have a lot of policies and procedures. It makes a ton of sense to build a low-code solution that employees can chat to and ask questions about those policies and procedures. But that only works if you have a single source of truth, where every policy and every procedure has been clearly defined, and you don't need to have a human decide, oh, actually go to this version of the documentation or that version of the documentation. So we can take a lot of these lessons learned from highly regulated industries about how we have controls in place and governance in place, and it turns out any brand who's serious about deploying a system that anybody depends on for decision making should have some of these controls in place. Good quality documentation, single source of truth, and unpacking this black box model notion into what are the components and how do we insert controls over them.
And again, I'm just going to reflect on something. You do not sound to me like a coder or a tech person. You sound like, frankly, and I don't mean this in a rude way, someone from risk and
Yeah,
audit.
fair enough.
Why is it? I guess that strikes me as probably one of the areas of risk or friction we've got here, is
Yeah,
that people are looking at this as a technology problem.
sure.
It is a business problem, which is a little cliched, but more specifically, it is a
Yeah,
problem of clarity around process, procedure, of principles, of ethics.
yep.
What's it going to take, or what does it take for an organization to get their houses tidied up in this area? Because again, I think all the focus will be on, hey, we bought the AI version of Tableau. Let's go
Yep.
deploy it. And everyone's focused on getting the tech out, and not enough money at the board level or at the project level is being put into these things. How do we get the business's attention?
So, just to react to that whole sound like an auditor, oftentimes I think governance within the enterprise gets misconstrued or it's misexecuted as the clamps, as the we're going to constrain innovation, we're going to constrain growth. I love the phrase that brakes help us go faster. We're able to
Yes.
have F1 car racers.
In Melbourne this week, they're about to practice that exactly. You've got me where I live. Keep going.
I love it. I love it. So very, very timely. But they can take tight turns because they can slam on the brakes. They can accelerate because we have a control in place and we know exactly how and when to deploy.
Mm.
And so, in my experience in the enterprise, to get ahead of it, when you can go to your board, when you can go to your leadership team and say, hey, we want to deploy this new solution, and we think it's going to increase conversions by 5%. And we think it's going to reduce the total number of tickets that are submitted to our support team by X. And by the way, here's how we know when a human needs to intervene, or here's how we're going to choose to route what gets automated, what gets escalated to a human. This is how we're going to approach quality control. This doesn't need to be an exercise of forever waiting to perfect the data. It's an exercise in trying to ask the questions of how could this go wrong, and have we thought through how we're going to ensure that when it comes time to scale, we're ready to scale and we have the brakes to be able to pull back when we need to.
Yeah, and I'll reflect on one thing before I ask my next question. My experience, because I spent probably 20 years of my life selling and marketing IT governance solutions. And one of the things I observed is that the word governance to an American has a very different connotation to a
Sure.
European. A European goes, "Oh, governance, that's a good thing. It's about rigor, and it's not about control. It's just about rigor and discipline."
Yeah.
A North American interpretation is often kind of tinged with, as you say, it's a restriction. It's somehow
Right.
going to hold us back. So there's definitely a culture part involved. What does a good team look like? I guess that's where my question was going. Is as I'm building my team to
Yep.
deploy these AI technologies, and my goal is to make sure that it's going to be boring. I've probably bulked up trying to hire all of these data scientists and AI folks and prompt
Sure.
engineers. Who's missing from my team?
We have three family roles in my practice at Further. We've got the machine learning engineers, and these are individuals responsible for taking algorithms and scaling them up and putting observability and monitoring and continuous improvement in place for the models. We have our data scientists who are responsible with figuring out how do we do quality control, how do we train these models, how do we deploy them. And then we have AI strategists who serve a dual role, both governance and strategy and innovation. And I find that that dual role is actually really powerful because they're the same hat that is charged with coming up with the value proposition, as well as figuring out how we're going to safeguard it. And the idea is to position governance not as something that clamps processes down, but as a key enabler to get to that growth, to get to that value proposition, or very quickly decide it's not worth the investment because the value relative to the risk and complexity is just not there.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense. I want to talk about the regulatory environment if you've got a couple of minutes.
Yeah, let's go.
So we live in a bit of a two-speed world from my perception. You've got
Yeah.
you've got the Europeans who seem to be they've taken the mantle of the lead now in terms of really following on from things like GDPR and putting in place, or at least sponsoring government-sponsored policy around responsible AI deployment. Not that we know what that is yet, but we've acknowledged we need it. The United States, I think, was taking that approach to begin with, and that seems to be. And again, I don't want to be dismissive of it because, again, from
Yeah.
the outside, from an outsider's perspective, you can imagine how someone's interpreted the posture of the current government as being laissez-faire, which I don't think they've actually stated that they don't care. But you could get the sense of, oh, they've just basically authorized us to say, you know what, don't do whatever you want. What's your take on the regulatory slash the tone in the boardroom at the moment when it comes to this topic of regulation and also self-regulation?
So what's really interesting is the AI Safety Summit that happened just a few weeks ago in Paris. Had a convening of nations all around the world. And J.D. Vance from the U.S. Represented the U.S. government. Have a vice president at an event like this
Huge.
was a big indicator of U.S.'s position on this. And he went to talk about the importance of unlocking innovation, unleashing innovation. In fact, as a result of that, many of the countries in the EU, or the stakeholders from EU countries, started to try to pull back a little bit or slow down on how restrictive enforcement might be around the EU AI Act. And so I think globally we're entering a stage where a lot of countries are starting to question what is the purpose, what is the service, what exactly is it are we controlling? That being said, what's interesting is at the state level, there's a swell of proposed bills now happening within the US
Mm.
that are much more targeted. And frankly, I think that it makes a lot more sense to regulate the uses of AI than it is to regulate AI. We don't
Mm.
necessarily regulate energy. We don't regulate necessarily like raw materials. There might be some tariffs or trade influences on things like steel and wood, etc. But largely, when we regulate things, it's more of, hey, this is a medical device that's going to be inserted into a human. And so we need to have certain restrictions around how this impacts the human.
We don't regulate batteries, but we do regulate where
Exactly.
batteries can go. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so the same thing will apply to AI, and we're already seeing this at the state level. California, for example, and they're definitely pro-regulation, but in I think September or October last year, they signed into law 18 individual bills, some of which are as niche as how AI can be used when summarizing clinical information to patients. Great. We have a patchwork of laws emerging, but that's very specific. There's a series of checkboxes that you can have in place as an enterprise that's considering building or adopting that function. And it's not just California. Texas just introduced a bill earlier this year. And so it's really interesting, like when you have states that lean one way and states that lean another way, and both types of states are introducing these very focused, very narrowly applied laws and bills that are focused on applications of AI instead of more broadly all things AI.
If you were a lawmaker and able to influence this process in one direction or another, where are you leaning at the moment based on everything you're seeing?
I think that a lot of existing laws today are sufficient to manage the risks of AI. So software as a medical device is a really great framework to then extend into, well, what does this look like when we have a model that learns and adapts over time? Okay, we can start with that framework and maybe modify it a little bit. There are other laws that exist in place, like employment laws, that don't necessarily need anything new to change how we use or how we enforce regulation around AI in hiring and selection. We have employment laws that say don't discriminate. So don't discriminate with AI.
What's your take on cross-border, I guess, contradictions or discontinuities? Because I guess that is the other area that if you're an
Sure.
international player right now. So let's take aside. So there's two types of risk. We can talk about the material risk associated with a poor decision. So, for example, a patient has something done to them they shouldn't, or their data is inadvertently released, or whatever it might be. So there's
Yeah.
the apparent risk. But then we've got the risk of non-compliance or breaches, right, which is a separate kind
Sure.
of risk, which is more of a legal risk than it is an actual risk to a human or to a business in the material sense. How do we deal with that? If you're again today, that just seems to me to be an absolute quagmire. Am I in breach? Am I not in breach? How would I know from one minute to the next?
So when it comes to, I think enterprises today are far more concerned with how this plays out with generative AI use cases than they are with general purpose uses of application like or of AI like predictive modeling or lead scoring, etc. When it comes to generative AI, the consensus that I'm seeing in the boardrooms and the board of directors types individuals that I interact with is the question of how do we know when something is going wrong? Forget about what the patchwork of regulation looks like. I have a friend, Olivia Gamblin, who talks a lot about AI governance in the space. And I think she was just on the show recently.
Fabulous, yeah.
Amazing, amazing individual. And one of her quotes that I love is legal is one step above criminal. Right? So, right?
You've just
So,
described my college years.
fair enough, fair enough. We're not going to talk about mine because I don't know where on that line I fell at certain points in time. But if we acknowledge that's the case, enterprises, to maintain consumer trust, often have to far exceed that minimum standard of being just legal. And so when it comes to deploying generative AI applications that could have unintended brand risk, or unintentionally create some sort of emotional harm to consumers, um, things that enterprises are generally consolidating and focusing on today at the board level is one, mapping out where is Gen AI being used in the in the enterprise. Two, how do we know when something goes wrong? How are we monitoring it? Three, what overrides and controls do we have in place for humans to intervene when that signal happens? And then four, do we have a failsafe for if all else fails, how to turn the system off and have a backup plan? And this all rests on the ability to continuously monitor. And this is where the technology comes back in. This is where you have, and I see a big growth on data science teams around, do you have the skill to implement QA and continuous monitoring and observability for these types of models that are going into production, or these systems that are going into production?
Quick side note. So in the world of flying, there's a really famous video from 1997 by a former American Airlines captain who then went on to train all of their pilots, and it's called The Children of the Magenta Line. And there's a video on YouTube. You can go back and see it. It's really kitsch because it's old 1997 video technology. But one of the things he talks about is the children of the Magenta Line are the pilots who'd grown, in his view, overly reliant on following the Magenta Line, which is like the GPS course indicator for a pilot.
Sure.
And he literally uses the phrase, he's like one of, listening to cockpit voice recorders, the thing that you hear on, fatal accidents most frequently is what's it doing now? Like, and they're
Oh my
talking
God,
about,
that is
no,
horrifying.
but this is a true story.
Yeah.
And he advocated for the idea that we need to be able to take control. And in the case of an aeroplane, you don't want to switch off all the automation at once because there are certain parts of the automation that are literally keeping you flying. And so he talks about this idea of, ratcheting down the level of automation in a structured fashion and flying the plane, as it were, and then assuming you get things back to a normal situation, putting it back in place. If I'm an enterprise right now, and I don't know if the analogy makes sense, is there a way,
Yeah.
because if I switch off some of this automation, it's highly probable my people wouldn't be able to cope with the data hose of information that's being pointed at them.
Sure.
Is there a mechanism by which we can build in controls and systems such that I can slowly ratchet down the automation without just literally going, it's an on-off kill switch? It's more of a thermostat. Thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So this is where I get back to systems thinking. If we talk about the omnipresent customer service AI agent, and that thing is the binary, turn it on, turn it off, well then yeah, we're going to have a problem if all of those requests start now being routed back to presumably humans that have been redirected to other things.
Yeah.
However, under the hood, we might have a system responsible for managing returns, a system responsible for collecting negative feedback on a interaction, another system that's responsible for helping with product selection, etc. And so each of these subsystems has its own control in place. And if we're turning one off, we're not turning it all off. And this is why I stressed earlier on, I find it far more productive to talk about these things as systems with components versus just omnipresent, here's the thing, it does all of the intelligence.
I think it's a really good point, and you're touching on a point that I think we speak about governance having a bad name, but architecture
Mm-hmm.
and design is equally important. So as you say, to think about it like a system, you need somebody who is looking at the whole rather than just looking at a component. And so again, having people with that architectural mindset, I think, is going to be so critical. We're about to wrap up. A couple of questions for you as we finish up. First thing is, what do you think the biggest opportunity, the most pressing challenge is going to be in the AI space moving forward?
I just put together a talk on this recently, and I think we have two huge opportunities, specifically for data scientists. One, getting more effective at quality control. So how do we define how we're measuring how these models are doing effectively? And then two, as multimodal language models get more sophisticated, more common, there's going to be a lot of these recipes that we can use. How do we extend quality control around multimodal models. How do we know that an insurance application that takes a photo of damage on your car, plus the claim that you're submitting, plus your claim policy, for example, how do we know when that's working well and not working well? So I think these are two big areas for data science teams to be working on and cultivating skills around today.
And last but not least, where can people go to learn more?
I am very active on LinkedIn, where I often share thoughts like what we talked about today and selfies of what I'm reading on airplanes as I fly from event to event. I'd love to hear from anybody who found any of this conversation interesting or relevant to them.
Perfect. No, thank you. And thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure that you'll be back on, especially as this area is developing so rapidly. And good luck with your mission on making AI boring.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
It's been great having you. Well, that is a wrap. Can AI ever be boring? Let us know what your thoughts are in the chat. I'm sure this could get pretty spicy. Thank you again to Cloudera. Thank you, Cal, for joining us for an episode today of the AI Forecast. And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you, everyone.